Everyone, thanks for joining us for Agile City Making Corridor Strategy to Site Feasibility in 45 minutes. I'm Holly Conrad Smith. I do customer success here at Giraffe, and I'm really excited to introduce to you Lucy and Rob, who are going to take us through this really exciting project and show us how to get the most out of this use case using Giraffe. So with that, Lucy, I'm going to hand it over to you and let's get started.
Thanks, Holly. I'll just share my screen. There we go. Thank you. Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen now. Yeah, thank you all for joining today. We're pretty excited about this too. Today we're going to be demoing a new feature called the SDK. We'll talk a little bit more, during the session about what that is, but essentially it allows us to deploy, I guess, like third-party apps. So anyone and everyone can use the SDK to build their own app and deploy it in Giraffe. So we'll show you how you can deploy one, or rather we have deployed one that Rob actually built with Mike in our team. And we'll show you how you can use it to interact with the map and sort of, manipulate your inputs and outputs. So the purpose of today is to, I guess, look at a corridor and a location and come up with a land use strategy for that location. So we're based in Sydney, so we've picked a location that's sort of in North Sydney, Northwest Sydney, called Denniston. We've picked this location kind of at random, and in that process found out that it's actually very well serviced by public transport. So we're looking at this specific station location right here. These sort of bubbles of different colors represent transport catchments. So not only is this station, on this train line that connects down to Eastern and Western Sydney, to our two largest employment centres, it also connects directly to the new metro, which is a sort of faster train than the normal train, which has got really great service. It's also very close to a light rail catchment as well that takes users straight into Parramatta CBD, which is a big employment hub. It's also pretty close to the ferry. So I would say by Sydney standards, it's actually a very well-serviced location. But what we can also see is that if we turn on the zoning map, it is pretty low density zoning. So it's sort of typical suburban Sydney, some nice parks and whatnot around. But because we are in a housing crisis here in Sydney, but I guess most of the world is in a housing and affordability crisis, we thought we might take a look at the capacity for this specific train station to accommodate more houses. So we're going to start off by doing a few things. I've obviously prepared a whole bunch of map content, including, some nice little points of interest here that kind of talk to what's happening in this location. There's plenty of schools. There's two sort of large local centres. To the south, we have West Ryde, which has lots of shops, and then eastward to the north, which also has some nice local shops. There's lots of green spaces, all that sort of good stuff. The purpose of me setting up this kind of context ahead of time is that by the time we get to some land use controls or future scenarios for land use, Rob's going to then do a nice design on one of the sites, and then we're going to show you one more of our new features, which is called Places. And Places is really about publishing your project content to an audience. So it's about curating it and walking someone through the sort of the project journey and story that you've been on. So we've got a whole bunch of this sort of pre-curated content. I'm going to jump right into it, and I guess Rob and I will sort of talk as we go, but please drop questions into the chat, and we'll see where we get to in 45 minutes. So the first thing I'm going to do is just turn off these layers. I'm going to make a new drawing layer called Catchment. I'm going to use the isochrone tool, which some of you may have seen Rob and some others in our team play with on LinkedIn. This essentially lets you pick the type of travel mode that you're using. We're going to say a 20-minute walking catchment, which is large, but kind of not unusual for the distance that people are willing to walk to heavy rail as a mode of transport. I'm going to create that catchment, use the parcel typology to apply some graphics to it. And then we will remove that. And so now we've got our catchment. The next thing we're going to do is actually use the new SDK. So this is a new app, as I mentioned, that Rob and Mike built. And what it does is allow us to do some pretty basic GIS joins. So we need some inputs, and the layers need to be added to the project beforehand. So we have a whole bunch of transport layers, as well as some local planning layers here for New South Wales. And we're going to use all those things as inputs. So the first thing we need is a boundary. And I obviously made a layer called catchment, which is this red catchment. And then we need to join it to something, and this is usually parcel data. So I'm going to pick the New South Wales Cadastre. And what this is doing right now is taking that polygon and then joining it to the local cadastre. So you can see that this has picked out any like parcels that it intersects with. So sometimes they sit a little bit to the edge of the boundary and it will capture them all, but that's the method we have used, and we think that's kind of the most inclusive way to do it. So once I've done that, you'll notice on the left what's happened is that we have a new layer called join, and it's a temp layer. And so what it's going to do in a second is let us join a whole bunch of data to those parcels that we've nominated. So I'm going to start by adding some joins. The first input layer that I want is the zoning. So it's going to fetch that layer, and we then pick a join method. I'm going to use containing, so it's going to sort of select whatever is contained within the parcel. And the property that I want to join is the SIM code. And so in New South Wales, if I show you, the SIM code indicates the color. So it tells us what zone this is from underneath the lot, which is really nice. The next one I'm going to do is the floor space ratio. This will tell us what the existing control is on that site. Another one that I want to do is the heritage. So this is basically going to let us take a look and see if there is any constraint on that site. So in Sydney specifically, we pay a lot of attention to heritage because we want to maintain local character. So doing this, this join here will basically let us filter out any lots that might have some heritage. And because we looked at this ahead of time, we know that there's actually a lot of sites and conservation areas in this catchment that will have a heritage influence. So we're going to join that. And then the last one is really just for demonstration purposes, just to show you how powerful Mike and Rob's little app is. And what we're going to do is actually join the distance to train stations. So this one's really nice, but really simple to do. So we're going to pick the train station locations. And the method that we're going to do this time is distance instead of containing. So we have a few options here, and we'd encourage you to play around with them. But distance is really great. We don't actually need to use any of the properties that are contained in that train station one. So what I'm going to do is make a new property and call it train distance. And here we get to pick the rounding. I'm going to say every 50 meters is how I want it to break up this join. So those four things have been joined to this layer. So we have this temp over here that has all these interactions with it. And what I'm going to do is actually use our lens tool to filter on it quickly. So if you haven't used lens before, this is kind of another really basic sort of GIS tool. We're going to begin by filtering on some of those things that we have just joined. So the first one that I'm interested in is lay class, which is our heritage. And if anything is an item that is a general item of heritage or a conservation area, I'm not interested in doing a future land use scenario on it. We're not likely to be able to actually change the character of it through a rezoning or change the density. So there's kind of no point considering it. If we had joined some other properties like strata or a recent development, so if there's a DA or some sort of application for change, you might want to remove those sites too by joining that information, which is definitely possible, just not in 45 minutes. You could start filtering out all those sites to get a really realistic view on what is actually developable in your catchment. We'll just stick to heritage today. I might actually just do one more, which is filter out any of the SP2 zones. So In Australia, SP1 and 2, or rather in New South Wales, is usually like an infrastructure zoning, and that should remove some of those lots that sit within the transport corridor, which we usually wouldn't build on. Now that I've done that, I've kind of got all the sites that I want to use. So we're going to come back over to the right-hand side here, and we're going to click this button called Bake to a Layer. And what this basically does is takes everything that we have just joined and bake them onto a new layer in Giraffe. So it's a vector layer, and you can see that is here, just dropped in at the bottom, called Join Bake. So I'm going to turn that original join layer off now, and we're going to begin looking at this joined bake one. If I open the lens control again, we can do a number of things at this point. We've already filtered out the sites we don't want. So everything that's left, we want to actually apply a land use to. But I will just show you one of the advantages of what we did earlier, which was to join something like the distance to train stations, actually lets us do some really nice styling and tell a story about this particular location. Let's pick this color ramp. And so what this is actually doing is showing us which stations are closer, which lots are closest to which station. So you can, make some really beautiful diagrams and tell stories about your, the data that you've created. This is just one example of a kind of join that you could do. You could do this with population data, building footprints, any number of different things. And once you've joined the right characteristic, you can then style it to tell whatever story you're interested in. So we'll just get rid of that for now, and we'll go back to the outlines. And what we're going to do at this point is actually do our future land use scenario. So now that we have this baked layer, we're going to go to the second tab over here in the app to the apply. And what apply is going to let us do is take some pre-configured usages. So everyone who plays with Giraffe should be familiar with the concept of usages. We have made some, I guess, more generalized land use typologies or usages rather than the building ones. These are really simple at this point. They generally just have a height attribute, which lets us sort of max out the envelope. And then some other things like target floor space ratios and site coverage ratios that Rob is going to use later on in analytics to calculate some yields. So the way that this second tab works is that we want to pick an input layer, and that will always be our join baked layer. So we'll find that one. What we're doing with this next mapping property is essentially taking attributes that we joined originally to that cadaster and breaking them up. So I'll just take sim code first to demonstrate, and we'll turn that joined bake layer off now. We've got a new temp layer called apply. And you'll notice that if I just show you the difference, what this apply layer is doing is basically finding any adjacent sites that have exactly the same attribute that you selected. So in this case, we're looking at zoning, and that means that everything within this lot here has exactly the same zoning. So that's a really nice way to break up sort of an area by character or density or something like that. But we can continue to break it up. So the next thing I might do is pick FSR. Now, what happens when we do that is that some of these other areas got broken up even more into sort of 3 or 4 or more polygons. And the purpose of that is to show combinations of exactly the same zoning and FSR so that we can much more accurately begin to start mapping a future land use scenario. So I'll just start applying these, and maybe while I'm thinking this through, Rob, you can sort of come in and start talking about the next stage. If you're
okay, yep, I'm here. Why don't I jump in? So I'll grab the screen as well.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm here. And ideally, you can see my station capacity screen. And I'm just going to hit refresh because I know Lucy's in here somewhere. I know she's done a whole bunch of work. And as soon as I've hit refresh, that join bake layer is visible to me. and I can see her working away. So what we thought we would do now, this kind of macro view, Lucy, when Lucy and I were at Cox, Lucy would be doing these macro strategic land use studies, sieving out constrained sites and then mapping new land uses to them. And I was either doing GIS support, which is now fully automated by this app, or I was doing some precinct planning. So whilst Lucy is going to be mapping out the future land use, so what was R2 or what was low density becomes medium density potentially, or what was medium density becomes mixed use. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dive straight into doing a study area. Now, we know because of our contextual analysis that this little triangle here on West Parade, just south of the station, whilst it's surrounded by heritage zoning, is not itself heritage zoning. And so I don't even need Lucy to finish her land zoning operation to know that this is going to get zoned to a high density.
Just quickly,
So,
if you do, there it is. Yeah, there you go.
So
Do you
Lucy's
want to
now
just
finished.
talk through what
I'll
these
talk
are
through the
quickly?
analytics. Right. So what's happened is Lucy has taken the apply baked layer and turned it into giraffe geometries. And it's important that they're giraffe geometries because two things. First, they can be edited now. So I can grab this and say, this is residential low density. I'm going to make an executive decision to make it residential high density. As soon as I change that, you can see that zoning envelope has changed. So they're editable. And the second thing that's important about them is because they're giraffe geometries, they are open and exposed to analytics. So the analytics function in Giraffe is able to pick all of these things up. So this residential area is taking the gross area of each of these polygons and the floor space ratio, which sits in each usage. So if I go to the residential land usages, the floor space ratio for residential high density is set to 2.0. And so the residential area is, this million square meters of residential. I don't know if I'm picking everything up. There's probably some mixed use, etc., that I'm not. Yes, so I'm not picking up in this calculation the mixed use, but we could add that in. So the point here is that this GIS kind of polygon editing, layer editing stuff. See, we got an extra 200,000. Moves from the GIS macro servers, where we're literally pulling data down from New South Wales digital twin servers and gets transferred into Giraffe at the precinct level, where we're dealing with at least hundreds of geometries, but not millions. So 431 geometries. And so then we're able to make refined sort of more mid-level decisions as opposed to full corridor decisions. And what I'd like to do now is say, okay, now let's say this red area is identified as a collection of sites that is ready to be upzoned to 2.0. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off the baked layer and I'm going to start modeling an actual precinct. And here, rather than thinking about the city as a series of like blobs that have metrics like FSR or site coverage or height, I'm going to start thinking about the city as at least building masses, not quite to the level of glass and columns and concrete, but one level closer to that. All right, and so if I turn down the heritage, we can see Miriam Park is over here. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new drawing layer, and I'm going to call it, I'll call it Miriam Park Master Plan. And everything that I do is going to be on that layer. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create that park, Miriam Park, as a giraffe geometry, and I'm going to just put some trees on it so it sits nice and visible as I'm telling my story. Now, before we start designing, we sort of get the principles right. And the thing that I'm noticing over here is this reserve street is almost making a grid. And so what I'd like is a walkable neighborhood, high density but walkable. And I'm going to connect a line up the guts to West Parade, so people in this new master plan precinct will be able to walk straight to the station. And we should also probably do another connection here, so complete this grid. So through Reserve Street, maybe we pull this park back, and that's already starting to give us some kind of a structure in terms of breaking this large amount of land up. And then the next thing I'm going to notice is the heritage. So obviously this thing is fronted by this heritage conservation zone. So on the west and on the south, but on the north it's just the train station. So no one's going to complain. In New South Wales or in Australia, or indeed anywhere in the southern hemisphere, the sun comes from the north. It's the strangest thing when you move from south to north hemisphere. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a series of low scale to the heritage zones, and I'm going to do these kind of perimeter blocks because I love them. They're big in Europe and they're very nice. And what I'm trying to think of here is sort of communities of people living there. And I'm just going to be massing them up like this, just as blobs of usage, of the residential usage. And I'm thinking of them as sort of maybe four-story buildings. And you can see they're not very deep. So I'm setting them to about 15 meters deep, which is probably even too deep. I may go down a little bit so that you can get apartments that go all the way through, like apartments that look like that. So light from two sides, probably point loaded. The classic Australian typology, the point tower, which I'll do over here, is a double-sided corridor, as in, so you get an 8-meter deep apartment on each side. And then in the middle of each perimeter block, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little park. And the idea here is that this becomes like a little community. And so the people here know each other. You know, there's resi on the floor. Potentially what I'll do over here is put some retail on the south side of this path that's leading from the park to the station. Put some retail, make it one level. I may actually slide it under. So this becomes sort of shop top housing, proper mixed use. Then I've got this floating building right now. So I'm going to copy that and drop it down to the ground and pull it away from the retail, so that the retail, so we get this sort of slot. There we go. If I lower the number of levels, we've got what we needed. All right, so now the last thing to do is just change my ground level floor to floor. So in Giraffe, you can always override the floor to floor height at a geometry level. So I'm going to set that floor to floor to 4.5. And now we have a beautiful functional perimeter block. I'm just snapping everything so it looks a bit neater. All right, and now I'm just going to copy paste this. Now, the fun bit about what I'm doing here is that as I'm working, I'm not thinking about the areas or the mix or anything, but Giraffe is doing that for me. So I can say just by doing these two perimeter blocks, we've got 23,000 square meters of GFA and 300 homes. And that's all fully parameterized, as in if I change the mix and say, you know what, we're going to do a bit of some studios at 55 square meters, some one beds at 70 square meters, and some two beds at 100 square meters. And I hit save on that, you know, after discussion with the go-to-market team or whoever it is, everything updates. And now we're down to 248 dwellings because the mix has changed. And so this move from like right out, zooming out the entire, you know, suburb or catchment right into the shape of this built form and how it looks happens very naturally and very easily. All right, I'm going to finish. I better make some public space. So I'm going to do an avenue, a nice walkable avenue that connects to Parade there. And you can see when I've done that this is the classic, right? This is traditional city making. It's all for the car. So I'm going to change that completely. We're going to have a very narrow road, 5 meters wide. You're going to have to drive at a top speed of maybe 12 kilometers an hour, but we're going to have this very wide pavement. And so this street is designed to walk along. And as you walk from your house up to the station or wherever you go to the grocer or the pub, you can imagine this being really activated by people that live in these kind of sub neighborhoods. And I'll do one more on the north side, and then I'll chuck a tower on it. And at that point, I will say we are complete. Just to show you some of the flexibility here, maybe what we want to do is on the north side of this road, just to make sure the sun is not, you know, it's not getting fully overshadowed. We're able to sculpt where necessary the top floors. And I'll do 1 point building just because, and I will pull in one of my template projects. So maybe one of the things we've done is bought in a template, a hotel, or maybe some built to rent. And so I've just dived into one of my other projects, my template hotel project, and I've picked up this feature. And I'm going to create this new usage. I'm just going to drop it in. All right, and there's my hotel. And you can see in this instance, I've used Flow Builder to create like this really articulated building. It's got a base height over here of 4.5 meters, and it's got all these balconies and everything. Maybe we're putting that as short stay accommodation overlooking the train station. And let's put a large format retail over here, and we won't connect that to this. It's service from West Parade, so we won't worry too much about parking. So I'm going to put that retail, make it one level. I always prefer it around the corners. I don't know if that's better constructible, but it looks a bit nice. And now we actually are considering the building as a building, and you can see like there's facade modulation and there's balcony depth, and all of this stuff is parametric. So the ridiculous thing that we're doing here is zooming, considering the city at the broadest level as a bunch of polygons, all the way down to this facade, and we can have meaningful conversations about the shape of this facade and its modulation and how many balconies there are, and whether the balconies need to be bigger or should we stick them out heaps far, or should they be tiny little fake balconies? And we can talk about the noise from the train. And so every expert and every consideration about this place, about whether this place is going to function as a master plan and be nice, from the macro to the micro, can be considered, and all of the numbers and all of the evidence is being automatically generated. So we now have 42,000 square meters of GFA. So 34,000 of residential GFA, which is 432 homes and 2,000 square meters of retail in this master plan. And we know the open space ratios, we know the number of parkings required. All of that sort of endless number crunching is automated. And I'll pass back to Lucy.
Thanks, Rob. Do you want to unshare your screen? Perfect. And then I'll come back. So let's do a quick recap, because a few things have happened over the last sort of 20, 25, 30 minutes. So we went from the cadastre, which had no additional information. We then joined it to the zoning, the heritage, and we also applied a distance to the station. What I then did was use some basic rules to start assigning usages en masse to this entire catchment. Now, I hope you sort of understand that that is step sort of, 1.5 out of, a 3-step process. Applying these sorts of usages en masse is not always, a really great rule, because, here, for example, you're within, almost 0 meters proximity to the station, and we had applied a medium density residential usage, which may be appropriate in some contexts, but here, once Rob's done a little test fit of that site, perhaps that medium density usage was not appropriate, and so going up to a higher density is. And it might be the same on a lot of other sites. So the purpose of baking these geometries as giraffe geometries means that it's really flexible, and you can sort of get in there then and start massaging that land use strategy to start reflecting, the appropriate envelopes and usages that you want. So what will basically get you to is a point where you can begin to very dynamically see your numbers begin to change as you do your land use strategy, and as maybe someone else in your team begins to actually do some testing of real sites to see how feasible they are with that typology. So here we have a land use strategy. We've tested something. Let's assume that we're all very happy with the outcomes. The last step in this process is to actually publish a story about this. So I'm just going to do a few things really quickly. I'm going to make some nice clean groups, because the point of doing this is that you're essentially publishing this project and all its workings to anyone that you would like to see it. So you want not only your map to tell a really clear story, you want these layers on the left-hand side to also tell a very clear story for you. So I'm going to turn off Rob's scheme for a minute. And I think this little guy got stuck on default, maybe.
Yeah,
Yep.
probably.
So we're just going to move that layer to Miriam Park Master Plan. It's gone, which is great. So we've got our land use scenario, which I'm just going to rename. And we're going to create a view. So I've already gone ahead and made some views previously. One was just to show the local context, which was that opening shot that I showed you. And then one that's about the zoning. And we'll call this one land use scenario. Now these views, for any sort of existing Giraffe users, hopefully this is a tool that lots of you use. It's very handy because what it lets you do is set a camera angle and a combination of layers. The next thing I'm going to do is actually just turn Rob's scheme back on and turn on the cadaster, and we'll get in nice and close and get a really great perspective on this. I might even turn on the 3D buildings. And then we can begin to see that in context. So we'll do one more view now and call this proposed scheme. And we're now going to go and use these views that have been set up in our Places app. And what happens in the Places app is it's essentially where you begin to curate this story. So I've already added it to the project and I've already played with some settings. We have other sort of videos and training on this, so we're not going to go through a lot of content with this, but I am actually just going to quickly populate these themes. So we have a location, and then we have 4 themes that are part of this story. One is about the local context, one's about planning controls, one about the built form envelopes, and the scheme that Rob came up with. So now we're just going to populate these with some views. So the view for this one that I made is local context. I do have some generic images that I'm just going to use for this presentation, but any of you who use Giraffe know that you can load any image at any time. We will host it. You're then given a URL which you just paste in. We don't really need to give these a name. So this one is about the local zoning. We'll give this one the same image. And then 2 more. This one will be the land use scenario. And then this one will be Rob's scheme. So all we're doing when we're assigning these views is essentially dictating where the camera angle will go and where the content, what content should be turned on at any time. So I'm really happy with all the settings here. And what we're going to go do now is into preview mode to show this story that we can then provide to our stakeholders or our managers, whoever we like. So this is just a little welcome. This text is completely editable and you can say whatever you like. But once you do that, what you're really giving these users is a really lovely curated map and then some content on the right-hand side. So at the moment, I've only given this image and the heading as the direction that I want. I've got some pretty generic text here that I'm going to add to this carousel item. We'll make this a little bit cleaner. So this talks about a completely different project, but you'll hopefully get the idea. We can also just get rid of that heading there. And what happens then is that essentially we begin to walk the users through a brand new story about this project, so they can see the planning controls, any commentary that we might have on it. And then we'll move into the built form proposal. So again, we would edit the text and the image to go with that. They can move around the map at any time. They can zoom in, look at stuff from any perspective that they like. And if they come back to, I guess, this carousel of information, it will still redirect the camera and change the angles, you know, to help you tell that story. So that is the preview mode. I hope you're all pretty amazed that in just around 35 minutes, we went from the corridor level, did a GIS join, which normally you would have to go into, you know, 2 or 3 other programs to do, kept it within Giraffe, let you then drill down, create a whole new future land use strategy, and then test fit a proposal within one of the envelopes. That's it.
Good job, Lucy.
Holly, Rob, anything we might need to touch on that we missed during that explanation?
I did have a
There's
couple of questions in the chat if you'd like to answer some questions.
Yes,
perfect.
let's definitely do that.
Awesome. So Billy at the beginning of the webinar asked where the data on public transport was pulled from.
Oh, great question. So in this instance, I actually made these stations myself, but as many of you would know, there are a lot of different data layers that you can bring in, and it will talk to those. We are working on making a global transport layer for everyone, and that would allow you to nominate whether it's a bus or a train or a metro, whatever sort of transport you might have in your region. So it kind of does vary geography to geography, but we're trying to make that global for everyone. So yes, hope that answers your question.
Great. And then Leah wanted to know how you developed your assumptions that feed into your zoning analysis. So I know you mentioned briefly the concept of usages, but maybe showing us a little bit of what your thought process was going into those land uses.
Sure. Hey, Leah, nice to see you. Haven't seen you for a while. Rob, do you want to talk to that one?
Yes, please. So Giraffe is just a calculator. So think of it like a spreadsheet, like Excel, and there's an assumptions tab, and you just put in assumptions. So almost all of our users, whether they're government, developers, architects, from their professional experience, have their own assumptions. The default assumptions in Giraffe come from Lucy and my experience at Cox and other architectural firms. But the way that we see it work best is because those assumptions are connected live to the geometries and to the outputs. You can actually go into a meeting and discuss those assumptions and get agreement. So like Lucy just there had one of the land uses open, and if she decides to change, the FSR from 2 to 3, and she makes that change, the model and the outputs will change. So it's designed to be extremely parametric and like that fifth that just popped up, right? So it's designed to facilitate a live discussion and testing of the assumptions in real time. But we don't provide the assumptions. It's not in our, that's our users know better than us, if that makes sense.
Great. Let me just see. Liesel was asking if the total dwelling count under the zoning analysis could be included in including the existing dwellings in these usages. Mikey mentioned that there's a way to do it with the SDK, but I'm wondering if you might suggest something else as well.
Yeah, no, totally, we could do that. So what that would mean, so there's a number of things. So there's actual existing dwellings, which normally you have to pull from a data source like the census or whatever it is. Then there's existing capacity, as in given existing zoning, how many buildings could be built. And then there's proposed capacity, as in if we took the zoning and we upzoned it, how many buildings could be built in that case. And normally you want to say, here's what is, here's what's possible, and here's the new possible. And so for us to do that, Lucy in that join would join in the FSR, and we would just construct an analytic with the existing FSR instead of the proposed FSR. So it is technical. It's sort of unavoidably technical. I think what we're showing you here is kind of magic in that sense. It's like months of work condensed down to 40 minutes, but at the core of it, it still is GIS analysis. And so you have to sort of hand someone, either you or on your team, needs to be comfortable with understanding what the methodology is, what the data points you're trying to get, and then hooking it all together.
Great. And then Jonathan just asked if joins can be exported into other GIS programs. I know we didn't practice sending this through Speckle, but I don't know if you want to do something on the fly or Just talk
Well,
through it.
Lucy, Jonathan, what Lucy's editing on the screen right now is a GeoJSON. So if she hits Control C or Command C and pastes it into a text editor, it is GeoJSON. You can drag it straight into QGIS or ArcGIS. So GeoJSON is the JSON GIS format. So it is a GIS program, and then like Holly said, pushing it into Speckle. And maybe let me grab the screen for a couple
Yeah, go for it.
seconds because I want to show you some cool stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, sweet. Okay, so let me just get to the project, and I'll add Speckle. So we have this public app, and you have Speckle over here. Speckle is a fantastic program that takes you that allows you to export up into the cloud, and then from Speckle you can go into any you can go into QGIS, you can go to Revit, you can go to Rhino, SketchUp, all of those. But what I wanted to show you just in the last little bit is I've been using Visoid, and what I did was I grabbed, sorry, my boy needs to go to the toilet, but hopefully you can hear that. Okay, buddy, off you go. So if I turn on my master plan, I just want to show you this. So here I put this image, I took a screenshot of it, and I chucked it into the AI. And you can see the AI has created this render, which is a very happy, cheerful summer render. That's because my prompt is summer aerial image architectural urban precinct. And that happened in the last 4 minutes of the call, which I think is incredibly useful as a way of explaining not just the block and the stack, but what this thing may feel like in a sort of pseudo photorealistic way. So I'm going
And
to stop sharing.
ideally you'd load that story then, or that image into the end story that was explaining, that project journey, and you can show, some sort of architectural renderings of the test fit that you did really quickly. Yeah, it does look easy when you've rehearsed it a little bit and you do it every day. But I guess, maybe one of the points that we'd make would be that, we did this in 45 minutes with maybe, an hour or two of preparation and thinking beforehand. Imagine if you use the typical month-long cycle that you had on a project to, spend a couple of days really interrogating your assumptions. Another one, even just one full day sort of playing with the envelopes that you were generating, and then a couple of days testing, 2 or 3 sites, you would have something exceptionally robust, that can be done in one program. All the data is there and kept and traceable, very spatially visible. Yeah, it's pretty exciting workflow. I think we're almost at time. Were there any other questions in the chat that you could see, Holly?
No.
I think we've answered most of them.
Yeah, we've answered all the questions, I think, and everyone's just saying thanks, and I agree. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from this session. I hope everyone else did too. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.